This is Margot Granite again. So glad to have you all join us today in our second session of the Capacity Building Gender Mainstreaming Initiative with CRFM today. I see lots of familiar names from those of you that joined us on Tuesday's session as well, so welcome back. We are excited also to have a couple of new people online. And yeah, all right, we are just, I believe waiting for one of our panelists, but I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I saw her, and then we can get going with their presentations and enjoy this discussion. All right, so hi everyone. So for this session, we're going to have our two experts on gender equality in the Caribbean share their perspectives and experiences. We have Professor Rhoda Reddock, an educator and social activist, and also Ms. Tonni Brodber, the Deputy Representative from UN Women's Multi-Country Office in the Caribbean. So Professor Rhoda Reddock, some of you may know from this space. She is an Emeriti Professor of Gender, Social Change and Development at the University of the West Indies at the St. Augustine campus. She also served as Deputy Principal and first head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. With over 70 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, her 8 book publications include Women, Labor and Politics in Trinidad and Tobago, A History, Elma Francois, The NWCSA and the Workers' Struggle for Change in the Caribbean, Interrogating Caribbean Masculinities and Sex, Power and Taboo. Quite an impressive list. She is active in the national and Caribbean women's movement and other social causes. She's the recipient of numerous national, regional, and international awards, including the Triennial CARICOM Award for Women in 2002, a Fulbright New Century Scholars Award in 2004, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Western Cape, South Africa in 2012. Professor Reddock is currently an executive member of the International Sociological Association from 2018 to 2022, and an elected expert on the UN Committee for Elimination of Discrimination Against Women for 2019 to 2023 period, also known as CEDAW. So welcome, Professor Rhoda Reddock. And also I want to introduce Ms. Tonni Brodber. She is serving as the Deputy Representative from 2015 to 2020 with the Multi-Country Office in the Caribbean. Before this, Ms. Brodber was the team leader for the Advancing Gender Justice in the Pacific program with UN Women Fiji Multi-Country Office. Ms. Brodber served as the Gender Specialist for the United Nations Development Program in South Africa, as well as briefly with the UN Women's South Africa Multi-Country Office, and established what is now the UN Women Country Office in Haiti. Ms. Brodber's work experience also includes lecturing in international relations and development studies at Yanshan University in China, and directing and co-producing a film in Haiti, on Haiti. Ms. Brodber received her first degree from the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, and has postgraduate degrees in development studies and business administration from the London School of Economics and the School of Economics Business School in Barcelona. She is raising 2 sons with her husband, and we are so lucky to have you both join us today. I just want to make sure that we've got both participants online right now. And if we do, I'm going to go ahead and ask us to welcome Professor Rhoda Reddock to provide some brief comments. And then we'll follow with Ms. Tonni Brodber, and then we'll open it up for a lively discussion with them where you are able to pose questions and we'll hear their responses. So thank you so much and welcome, ladies.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to see so many people on from various parts of the region. And I hope we can have a really lively discussion. I have had the privilege to be involved in activism and scholarship in relation to issues of women, gender, and masculinities from my base in the Caribbean, but also through local, regional, and international networks. I think from a very early age, I had a sense of equality and social justice. And when at the age of about 5 or 6, I realized that there were some differences between women and men, I began to think that this was not something that should continue. So from very early, I had this gender consciousness as well as a social consciousness, because I think they are both interrelated. And I was fortunate to be coming of age at the time of what we refer to as the second feminist wave in the Caribbean. So I was able to begin reading the many works coming out. And then when I went to graduate school, I was part of the emergence of one of the first graduate programs in what at that time was called Women and Development, but which is now called Women, Gender and Development at the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague. And while there, I also did my doctorate, which was a social and political history of women in Trinidad and Tobago. And I remember when I spoke to colleagues, they couldn't possibly think of what could one write in a thesis of that on that topic. And it's true, because there were very few publications on women at that time. You know, you had to read through many records, other books, and just piece together the information. But I ended up with a 700-page thesis, which was much too long. So it just shows that sometimes you have to do a little more work, but the information does exist. I was then fortunate to be involved in the institutionalization of women and gender studies at the UWI, and to develop a number of disciplinary and interdisciplinary courses and programs. And I think this is very important, because we tend to think of gender in a very limited sense. For example, some people think gender is women and men, which it is not. Gender actually is an analytical framework for analyzing human behavior, human societies, contexts, etc. And once you have the basic tools, it's possible to apply it to everything and almost anything. And this is what we really set out to do when we were able to, when I took on the leadership of the St. Augustine campus of the Institute. At that time, it was the Center for Gender and Development Studies. And we instituted teaching programs in sociology, in history, in linguistics, in natural sciences, in agriculture. Actually, agriculture was the first gender studies program at the St. Augustine campus, etc. And also through our research, where we took that forward, doing a range of multidisciplinary studies. For example, we carried out a study on the River Swamp, an endangered wetland. And for many people, they couldn't understand what could gender have to do with that. But by the time we were finished, we'd done a gender analysis of the space, the use of space by women and men. We found out, for example, that the forest was a space that women were not allowed to enter for a number of reasons. We looked at the division of labor. We looked at the kinds of jobs that women and men do. And relevant to your interest, we found that quite a lot of young girls were involved in fishing in the water ponds of the swamp for conch, and which was a common meal in that community where we did the study, as well as the cascadura fish, which is a particular fish of that area, which is a fish which has scales on the outside. So by the time we were finished with that study, we had accumulated so much interesting use on gender and natural resource use, on the division of labor within the home, outside the home, the gendered use of space, our government policy towards the swamp, the fact that it was a group of women, forestry officials, who had created a proposal for that swamp to become a wetland of international significance, which is why we were able to develop the persons living on the swamp to develop their custodial responsibility to the area, and as well as earn a living as they went along. So I have been active in the women's movement, also campaigning on issues from gender-based violence, economic situation of women, on I've also studied masculinities, I've edited a book, organized, so that all I can say is that gender analysis is much more than we have traditionally seen it, understood it. And it opens up all kinds of new and exciting ways of understanding the world. And as a result, it allows us to develop more comprehensive policy interventions, which of course would end up with better results. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That is fascinating and great to hear. Sets us off on a great foot to have this discussion. I've already got lots of questions I'm thinking of. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Ms. Brodber to go ahead now and share your comments, and then we will check the chat. Everyone, please go ahead and ask any questions in the chat you may have for our panelists, presenters, and then we will come to the question and answer period after this. So go ahead, Tonni.
I think Tonni's mic.
I've been chatting away.
Okay. Sorry. Sorry, trying to unmute you. Okay.
Giving you
We
all
can
kinds of accolades as well. I was saying thank you so much, Margot. It's a pleasure with everyone today, and it's a real honor to be able to follow Professor Reddock, who is I'm an admirer of Professor Reddock, not only her great work, but also her accessibility to a lot of younger feminists like myself who want to know more and are continuously learning. So, like Professor Reddock, and actually my title now is Representative AI. I am acting in the representative position, and I want to honor our former representative, Alison McLean, who passed away earlier this year. My introduction to this work, I am a child of the women's movement in the Caribbean. My mother was a member of CAFRA and also part of the University of the West Indies and the development of what became the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. So for me, my rude awakening was when I went out into the world and realized not everybody thought gender equality was a requirement for a healthy and sustainable world and society. And so I actually fell into gender equality. It was not my focus. It was something that was always part of my upbringing and lens. And when I say lens, my view of seeing the world. So I ended up doing courses on gender equality, but it was never my major. And when I had opportunities to volunteer or intern, I would always do so with feminist organizations. And I ended up doing that as well with UNIFEM at the time. With Haiti, and that's how I started my personal UN career, because at the time I really never wanted to work for the UN, but here I am. UN Women in particular started off as a fund in the field, started off as a fund for UNDP. We also were a research institute in the Dominican Republic, as well as two organizations, the Office advising the Secretary General on Gender Affairs, as well as the Division for the Advancement of Women. And thanks to civil society, who recognized that there was a significant gap in the work that we were doing, and when I say we, I mean the UN family was doing around development, because we did not have an entity focused on gender equality and women's empowerment. Everybody thought that they were doing it and that they were mainstreaming it, but there was a significant gap. So we were established in it was passed in 2010, and we were established in 2011. And in 2012 in the Caribbean, we changed our name to UN Women. We work specifically around tangibly making gender equality a reality on the ground through the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which Professor Reddock is a committee member. We support the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the Beijing Platform for Action, which is celebrating 25 years this year. And I think it's something that I would invite everybody to go and revisit, because there's good reference to women in agriculture and fisheries in this document that was done 25 years ago. But when you look at the progress that we have made, and it is a guide for what countries should be doing. and over 192 countries participated and signed on to this agreement, yet we are not halfway where we need to be. And I think yesterday, I was listening to the session from yesterday. This was something that all of the facilitators have said, no country has achieved gender equality and women's empowerment. And I think it is critical, especially from UN Women Multi-Country Office in the Caribbean's perspective, that we don't see gender equality and women's empowerment as something that is Western and that is being forced upon our countries, that it is not our culture. In fact, when you look at cultures, indigenous cultures across the world, equality is a fundamental principle. Colonialism and the legacy of colonialism, which we see replicated in the way in which gender roles are practiced in the Caribbean today, that is actually not necessarily our indigenous culture. So the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that's not a Western document. It is something that even colleagues from Afghanistan sat down, all of the independent countries at the time it was mainly Haiti and a few others from the Caribbean, sat at the table and developed this document. So one of the things that my learning has been in this work in the Caribbean is it is important for us to recognize that this is not external to us. This is something that we helped create in terms of the normative standards, and that we should all be striving towards in terms of a more equal community and country and region for us all. The other thing that we do within the normative space as UN Women is a lot of work on statistics and data. It's important for us not only to be speaking anecdotally, we need to know what is actually happening. One of the statistics that's often used about disasters is the percentage of women that died in disasters, and this comes from the tsunami. And it is a very relevant statistic because it demonstrates how marginalized communities and hazards exploit inequalities to create disasters. But in the Caribbean, anecdotally, what we've been seeing is that a lot of the times it's mainly men who die in our hurricanes and disasters. And that is not because gender doesn't matter. It matters because the reasons men are dying has to do with the kinds of roles they are expected to play in society. The ones that take the most risks, the ones that save other persons. So when we saw the deaths in Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, a lot of it had to do with people who, the immediate deaths had to do with people who were going to rescue their family members or reach out for other persons. And I'm not saying that they should not have or anything else. It's not an indictment. It is just an exploration and observation that we need more statistics to be able to better tell our story in the region. We've supported CARICOM as UN Women through ISUA EAHN in developing the CARICOM gender equality indicators, as well as a CARICOM model for how to measure violence against women and girls in our society. The other pillar that we work on at UN Women is women's economic empowerment. And this is where a lot of our work with women in the agricultural industry and the fisheries falls. We look at it through a human security approach, which is a contextual approach that looks at context-specific realities and in order to develop context-specific solutions. We work on advocacy, we work on technical expertise, and we work sometimes on direct project implementation. And when I say advocacy, look at COVID-19 right now. We've made sure to advocate not only from our level, but through our partners at the national gender machineries to make sure that the macroeconomic policies that are made take into consideration gender equality and women's empowerment. If you are asking people to go back to work, but schools are closed, it is a very difficult thing for parents to do, especially women who generally carry the large share of the responsibility in the homes and when it comes to childcare and domestic work. We also do the work on technical expertise, for example, social protection, assisting governments to figure out when you're thinking about your social protection measures, whether it is a welfare measure, a cash advance measure, how are you thinking about households? Are you just doing it generally without taking an intersectional lens? And I know you learned about intersectionality yesterday, colleagues that are on the phone. The other way in which we look at it is the direct implementation. We've been working closely with women farmers in Dominica, and through the Trust Fund Human Security, my colleague Angela Davis, who is our project coordinator for that, is online. So if you have more questions about that project, she can share what we're doing and what we're planning to do with that project. It includes coaching women, smallholder farmers and male smallholder farmers, as well as getting them a better understanding of access to land and finances, as well as climate smart agricultural practices. Our third area of work is ending violence against women and girls. And this has been the area of work in which UN Women has been in for the past 20 years. And it is probably the most obvious and egregious manifestation of gender inequality in the Caribbean and in the world. And as I think most people will have seen through the news, although we don't have specific data yet, because this would be around administrative data, what you get at the police and different civil society organizations, hospitals and clinics, we know that there has been an increase in gender-based violence. And this is what is now being called the shadow pandemic to COVID-19. So we work on response, supporting the police, supporting the judiciary, supporting other service providers to make sure the services are at a high quality level and reliable and sustainable. And we also work on the prevention. And this is a critical aspect of this work. And I think this is my biggest insight in all of the work on gender equality, is that it is very difficult to really make the lever change one way or the other when it comes to gender equality and women's empowerment if you aren't changing people's minds about what they believe women's roles are supposed to be and men's roles are supposed to be. When you look at some of the data that we have been able to glean from the prevalence surveys that we have implemented across the Caribbean, most people still believe in very traditional gender roles, and the people who are most at risk for experiencing violence in their lifetime are those that believe the most in the traditional gender roles. And then the last area in which we work is climate change and disaster risk. And so we do a lot of work on, again, the advocacy, technical expertise, making sure national adaptation plans are gender responsive, making sure people are thinking through what it means for a gender responsive resilience program, as well as in direct support. If there has been a hazard, we support our SEDEMA colleagues by going in to do rapid assessments as well as post-disaster needs assessments to make sure that no one is left behind. My main insights, though, around the work on gender equality and women's empowerment in the region is that it is sensitive work because it is touching at the fabric of who we think we are. If you, and we're getting these messages from ideological levels, so our faith, whether our sacred texts say one thing or another about the role women play and the role men play, and the fact that it is a binary. And we also are getting it from our institutions when we go to school and you're a girl and you're speaking all the time. Are you bossy? Are you overbearing? And for boys who are shy, are you girlish? Instead of you are who you are. And then our interpersonal relationships. If you have, I know in my family at least, when my nephew was a baby and was squealing with joy, my brother was telling him, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And I was like, "He's 9 months. He's supposed to be able to squeal with joy. Are you saying that men don't experience joy?" And then my brother and I got into a long conversation about whether or not joy is acceptable, because at a certain age, boys stop smiling and men are supposed to be reserved. So does that extend as well to a baby? So because what we do is chipping away at that very foundation, often people are very resistant to it because it is close to the things that they love the most, whether it's their parents' lessons. In some cases, it may be the way in which they have read their sacred texts, or it just may be something that makes them very uncomfortable to shift from because it is something that anchors them. And so that's why I think in our spaces, it is really critical that we make sure that we keep the door. Whatever you want to ask, we're open to hearing it. And, you know, we just ask that everybody's accountable. If you have an opinion, you're accountable for your opinion. You're not going to be judged for it, but you will have to be able to explain why you think that way. And we can go from there. But if people keep their thoughts secret, we never get a chance to really engage in a way that is healthy. That's it from me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tonni. That was fabulous and great to hear. Obviously, had such an impact on your younger childhood, and of course, having Professor Reddock, learning from her and her experiences, and then just all the work that UN Women is doing right now and has learned, I think is really fascinating. I see that we have a question in the chat box, but I wondered if I could maybe jump in with a question first, since there were a lot of points that you both made about pieces we discussed in our session on Tuesday around gender analysis and the complexity of that. And then also, Tonni, how you mentioned, you know, the gender equality is required for a healthy and sustainable world for our planet and for our communities. And we know that gender equality is so complex and that it has all these interlinkages, and also, you know, the mention ongoing with COVID that we have here. But I know, since, you know, the role that you both have had with international conventions and mechanisms, if you could kind of speak to a bit more maybe the role you see from the international down to the national level and vice versa of the Sustainable Development Goals, and also with CEDA, on talking, you know, about civil society engagement, on data, on different pieces of that, if for our first question. So Professor Reddock, if you want to go ahead and respond first, that would be great.
Thank you, Margot. Well, the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, are a great improvement on the ones that went before the Millennium Development Goals. I think they reflect a lot of thought. And of course, we were happy to see gender equality included as one of the goals. But also, we have to see gender equality as cross-cutting all of the goals. Now, I think in some countries of the region, there has been an effort to make the goals better known in the society, to have activities around them. I know we used to have them on our newspapers, at least some aspect of it frequently. And I think there's much more awareness of the Sustainable Development Goals. But at the same time as we have that awareness, I think that many of our countries, if we put aside for this point in time, put aside the COVID situation, which of course is very difficult to do, the actual attention to an implementing of these goals is difficult for human resource reasons, but also because the full implementation of the goals also has implications for the economies of our countries. And here in the Caribbean, over the past 2 decades, Caribbean economies have not been doing too well. The Sustainable Development Goals have come at a time where the major economic paradigm is not a very sustainable one, so that our countries have had to compete in a global free market system without many controls, and therefore our borders are open to imports from all over the world without controls and without systems of management. And at the same time, a great deal of our local production has declined because it was seen as not economically viable. And therefore, many of our countries have become more and more dependent on imported food items, even food items that we grew for ourselves at one time. So I think our economies have become very insecure, and in my opinion, not very sustainable. But I think that the COVID-19 pandemic, in a way, has forced us to rethink. I think this rethinking will happen throughout the world, at least I hope so. But certainly in the Caribbean, we have already begun to realize that we cannot depend on imports for our food. We cannot depend only on tourism for our economic security. And therefore, we have to also make peace with our environmental issues, because the force of the hurricanes and the frequency of hurricanes in recent times have increased the vulnerability of our countries. So we are right now in very difficult circumstances. And unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic, even though it makes these things visible, it doesn't really provide the tools for us to begin the implementation of new approaches that is definitely required. So I think that governments really need to work together. I think the regional bodies, the CARICOM Secretariat, the OECS are very important in looking at our current situation, but also evaluating the resources we have, the threats that are not implementing the goals have for our societies, and to come up with new approaches to economic planning, to trade, to food security, to economic security, environmental sustainability, etc. But I think that those of us who are in the civil society and activist movements also have to push, because I know that for those of you working in the public sector, sometimes it's good when states get an extra push from outside of the state sector. But of course, you too can use the mechanisms that you have to try to make changes that are necessary, and sometimes even to collaborate with non-state actors in facilitating the change that you recognize is necessary. So I think that the next 2 to 5 years are going to be very difficult for our region, but it will be more difficult if we don't seize the time to relook at the way our societies are organized, to make the best use of all of our resources. This includes our human resources, but also our flora, our fauna, our sea, what Prime Minister Motley refers to as the blue economy, as well as our diaspora communities, to really rebuild a more sustainable and viable life for those of us who live here.
Great, thank you, Professor. I think that was
I didn't deal with CEDAW, but maybe I could do.
Maybe you talk about CEDAW all the time, but that was a great, linkage between all the different pieces that are included in.
But I don't talk about CEDAW all the time, so maybe later on we can.
Yeah, sure. I think those linkages for all the different economy, food security, health, and environmental sustainability, like you were mentioning, and a lot of really great pieces. We didn't really introduce this, the initiative so much today, since you two are aware of it, and everyone that is online today has received lots of materials and have been part of this initiative. But many of the folks that we have that we're working with are, of course, from the public sector and the fisheries departments, but then also a lot of civil society actors as well, working on fisheries and along the value chain, but also women's rights organizations as well. So a range of different technical expertise areas. And so I think having that link of where we can integrate gender across the different sectors is really important, and a piece that we've been trying to work on. So Tonni, I don't want to take up space though from you, so please go ahead and share any insights from your.
Sure, thank you. I think, I mean, building on what was saying, I think the benefit of the Sustainable Development Goals is that they're political and that they center gender equality in development. And too often gender equality was seen as a silo to development concerns, and the real development concerns were our economy and all of these other things, and seen separate. And I think the power of CEDAW is that it's legally binding. And so I think that is something that we need to be a little bit more of. I think Rhoda went through a really great background of, and I don't know if this is part of our legacy, that we don't value as much of what we have here until it comes full circle. So I was, our food security issues, importing all the food when our food security bill is helping to balloon our debt. Most of our countries already have more than a 50% debt to GDP ratio. We should be making our own food. When we look at the development of our societies, we still are very external looking in terms of our production, even our tourism. When we're thinking of places like Italy and Greece and France, their tourism is because their people want to live there, their place is great and it is for them. When we are building lovely things, we're building it around tourism spaces instead of for our communities, and tourists come and enjoy our community as well. And so I think what the Sustainable Development Goals and what COVID-19 is making us do very quickly is recognize our markets have to be internal. I want to just address a question that has come up in the chat, that has been in the chat for some time, around the work of Barreto, Chevans, Johnson and Bailey. And the question about whether marginalization of men in the Caribbean is fact or fiction. My answer to that is that it is not a complete story. So I can't say it's fact or fiction. I think it is it's an incomplete analysis of what is happening in the Caribbean. When you look at the data with regards to who is graduating from university, sure, more women are graduating from university. But when you look at the unemployment data, and I know you shared some of that yesterday, more women are unemployed than men because women require more certification to get jobs than men do. So, and then when you look at the data around who is failing CXC, it is a above across the board failure. And you have to take that intersectional lens to say, is sex the only issue at work here? Is gender the issue at work here? Or is class the issue at work here? Have we always been a society in which all men and all women, or all boys and all girls, have the potential to succeed? Or is it one in which after common entrance, the top 10% do very, very well, and after that, whatever common entrance has evolved into now, those persons don't have as much luck? In terms of the fishery sector in general and mainstreaming gender issues in the fishery sector, I think what it tells us is that we have to be intersectional when we mainstream gender into the fishery sector. We have to see who is in the fishery sector and why. Is it something, most of the women, the research is showing most of the women who enter into entrepreneurship in the Caribbean do so from a point of pain. It is not because they want to be an entrepreneur, it's because they've either lost a job or they haven't been able to get a job, and so they create a business. So why are people in the fishery sector? Who is there? Who is making the most? Where are they along the value chain within the fishery sector? And that is where I think this kind of analysis helps us to inform what will move us forward, and whether or not it has any impact on, if the major characteristic influencing everything is sex, and I don't, or gender, and I actually don't think it is. And that's from me. And I know Rhoda wanted to say some more about CEDAW, and probably wanted to address the question as well.
Yes, thank you, Tonni. Professor, if you want to respond to either of those points, I know you had seen the question, so if you also want to provide some remarks, and also welcome you to comment on CEDAW, anything else.
Okay, thank you. The whole marginalization discussion is someone that we have engaged with quite a lot. And in fact, as the person who wrote mentioned some of the reading, the authors in the area, so for others who may be interested, they may wish to look at it, look at some of those references. I think it's important to know that Errol Miller, who coined that phrase, That was the name of a book he wrote, The Marginalization of Black Males, Lessons from the English-Speaking Caribbean. And in that particular book, he argued, not that men were marginalized generally, he argued, but that the British colonial powers were afraid of the power of Black men, and therefore they facilitated the educational development of women, especially women teachers, because they didn't want to have to deal with the militancy of the men in the teachers' union. That was his main argument. Now, most people never read the book, but the title was what captured the imagination. Now, later on, he published another book called Men at Risk. Again, I don't think most people have ever read that book, but the title is intriguing. And basically his argument in that book was a development on his earlier one. He tried to create a theoretical argument where he argued that powerful men would support the advance of women in order to keep less powerful men from taking over their situation. So none of these discussions was really dealing with I mean, this was a much larger, a much different idea. And basically what he argued was that the improvement that was being seen with women performing in education was not because of their performance, but because the colonial authorities had given women an advantage which allowed them to perform better than men. So there's been so much research since he made those arguments that has provided more data, more empiricism, and also the complexities of what we could refer to as post-colonial masculinities in the region, which I think is very important for us all to understand. In fact, as a result of that early work of Professor Miller, the Caribbean, I think, is one of the countries that has one of the best developed literature on men and masculinities. And in fact, I hosted one of the first conferences of the region in 1996, which just goes to show how long we have been working in this area. But I think now what we've understood is that a lot of the problems with boys' performance in schools has to do with the models of masculinity that they are forced to accept. And in fact, one of the important things is that young men and boys need to be empowered to chart their own way forward so that they don't feel powerless and have to give in to the pressures of society. In fact, one of my students did his MPhil thesis on this very subject in 5 schools. And what was so interesting is that based on the data coming from the boys, it was clear that they understood exactly what the issues were. In fact, the findings from the boys were just what the researchers were coming up with. However, the boys did not feel empowered to do what they knew was necessary in order to do well in school, because for a number of reasons. One, education had become feminized. It was now something that girls did well. And if boys did too well, they would have their masculinity challenged, and they might be called names, homophobic names. And for boys, that protection of their masculinity was very important. We found a number of other reasons having to do with how things are organized in the home, expectations, and how difficult it was for boys in our current setting to publicly perform educationally. For example, we found that if boys were doing very well, like the ones who were going to get the scholarships, they would stay because in a way it was competitive. Whereas if they had to perform, if they were mediocre, the hard work they would have to put in, they'd either have to hide to put it in, but they certainly couldn't let their colleagues see that they were putting in hard work. And therefore, many of them would just give up. Whereas the girls who were weak, who were middling, would struggle to and maybe end up mediocre in this regard. But there's lots of other data, lots of other contributing factors that explain the situation. But also the class issues, as Tonni pointed out, are critical, because I think all boys are affected, but the working class boys are the ones whose parents either don't have the resources or the skills to really do what is necessary. So many middle class and upper class families would just send the boys away to university or take them out of that school and put them in a different kind of peer environment, or just keep supporting them and pushing them until they actually do something with extra lessons, psychological interventions and other things. But the poor working class children, boys, whose parents are working full time, who have no support at home, and who are under the worst peer pressure, they're the ones that are performing and not doing as well. And I think the other thing that Tonni has raised is important. We have found that women get greater, it is much more important for girls to stay in school than for boys. In other words, many women who stay in school, get their degrees, end up sometimes with jobs in the public service, are earning less than the guys who dropped out of school, went and learned something else, and ended up earning more. So that so I think that these questions are much deeper than the surface of just that statement suggests. And it is very important for us to understand and address these issues, because if they're not addressed, the entire society suffers. So I think that what we have to be careful about is of women being juxtaposed against men. And this happens a lot. As a feminist, we have got accustomed to it. So whenever you raise the question of women, then somebody will jump up and say, yes, and what about the men? What about the young boys who are out of school who are committing crime? The reality we have found is the status of young men is closely associated with the status of their mothers. So that it's not a matter of either or. You have to take care of women as mothers, as sisters, as partners, as spouses. And when that happens, that also contributes to what happens with men, including young men. Oh, and I forgot CEDAW. Again. Okay, now CEDAW, I think, is a very important institution. Many of our countries are members, but most of the people in our region know nothing about CEDAW. In fact, most of the people in our region don't know about the UN human rights system at all. And it's a big pity, because it means that we are outside of the system that was initiated to safeguard all of our rights and to work against them being destroyed. So many of our countries are members. We don't even know when they submit their reports. We don't know what these reports, what responses are there. We don't know what the governments are recommended to do. So we cannot monitor and hold them to account. So I would really like to see much greater effort by civil society groups, by the UN organizations in the area, and of course by the gender machineries to educate the population about CEDAW and the other human rights bodies, so that people can know, for example, that if our countries exceed the optional protocol, then CEDAW is a court of last resort for addressing disputes that affect women in different parts of the world. And in fact, we just did a landmark judgment for some women in Bosnia-Herzegovina who, since those many, many years ago, this woman was not recognized for any compensation. I can't remember the reason why, maybe because it was assumed that it was the man who was economically responsible, etc. But after many years and going through many different legal institutions, CEDAW was able to make that historic ruling, not last week, in June, July. So I think that we need to know much more about these bodies, and because they are there to protect our rights. And CEDAW as well, we also monitor when governments come, the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. We look at what's happening in women's economic empowerment. We look at health and sexual and reproductive health and rights. We look at nationality law. For example, do women and men have the same nationality rights, rights in marriage and the family, rights against discrimination, against so many things that CEDAW examines. So I think we really need to know a lot more about what exists.
Great, thank you. Just on that last point about CEDAW, so in our next session, we will be sharing more information about CEDAW and the roles that the countries have and the reporting that they have all been participating in is exactly that mechanism for documenting and reporting on how gender equality across a spectrum of sectors.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. I'm mindful of the time. We just have about 7 minutes and we know everyone is very busy and we don't want to keep you, but I wanted to see if there were any other participants. I know we haven't had any other questions written, but if someone wanted to actually just either raise their hand or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question, we'd welcome that from any new participants. Thanks.
Sorry, Margot, this is Emmett. I see that Ian, you've asked a question. If you'd like to unmute yourself or turn on your camera if you'd like and ask your question.
It wasn't really a personal, it wasn't really a question, it's just more a comment. One of the things I find that COVID has actually highlighted is the way in which we actually structure society. When you look at some of the issues, particularly in respect to the informal sector, you have a high proportion of females actively engaged in this sector. And they tend to, in terms of, you look at the issue in terms of gender pay gap, issues pertaining to gender roles. I think we have to actually reevaluate how we look at, in terms of fisheries development, what are the basic infrastructure needed to actually deal with the whole issue of trying to achieve gender equality. That's my 2 cents.
To Ian, because I think that's so important that COVID-19 also exposed the social inequality in our societies. And in fact, I'm sure if you look at the data, our societies have become more unequal since the first 2 decades of this century. And I think it's also to do with that whole economic paradigm. Because of course, if all the jobs, all the agriculture stopped, we used to have manufacturing that stopped. A lot of our internal production stopped. Even fisheries was reduced here in my country. You know, where are the employment opportunities to come from? And if there's no employment opportunities, there's no taxes, the state doesn't have the resources to do other things to stimulate the economy. So what in CEDAW, we have been really, whenever countries come, we have been really trying to ask them to set up social security systems for the informal sector. Because what COVID showed us was how people were just there with insecurity. And it was really an indictment. Because first of all, we were told, after about week 2 of the lockdown, you were hearing some children had no food because they usually ate during the school feeding program. Amazing. Then we heard that some people had no money, so they were already starving. So in other words, it didn't take long for the whole thing to begin to disintegrate. The private sector had no money, they were living day to day. I couldn't believe how insecure all of the structures of the economy and society were. So I do think that even as we encourage people to go into so-called entrepreneurship, which I think is another issue for debate, we have to ensure that those who are self-employed have some sort of security, what the Jamaicans would call backative, because life is insecure. These women could lose their jobs. They lose their jobs, their entire family might be on the street. Children may have no uniforms to school. You know, things just break down. And I think we cannot have the future of our societies not having a better degree of stability.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say I fully agree with what Rhoda has said, and I do think that COVID-19, in the way that any kind of a hazard makes, and I'm sorry for the noise, I have to now be on the road, it makes visible what we had it as invisible before, and what was invisible but slowly deteriorating. So some of the circumstances that Rhoda has outlined, and also some of the really unsustainable ways in which we structured the gender division of labor. And I do agree with Mr. Horsford, we need to reevaluate and engender our social programs. And I can let you know that WFP, UNICEF, and UN Women are working in Barbados and St. Lucia to support social shock and gender responsive social protection programs.
Well, actually, I'm very happy to hear that. Anyway, sorry, Mr. Horsford, I'll respond after.
No, go ahead.
Good afternoon.
Yes. Alwyn, is that you?
Oh yeah, yes. Could I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Very good presentation for the afternoon. And gender matters. And within the Caribbean, there are many things that have actually happened over the years. And what I would not like to see, based on the errors that we have actually made in the past, that it becomes a pandemic. Because when we talk about gender is about everyone. And I think what we actually need to do is that we have now realized some of the errors that we had. Everything was diversified in one area. So it's just for all aspects of gender to actually work together. I'm hearing about women. I'm hearing about women, and I know that things have actually happened in the past. The whole colonialism part of it, and women should be in the house and all these kind of things and stuff. But I think that if we within the Caribbean, in this small space, if we work together with our men and with our women, we can actually get things done. Because what I would not like to see is that we have another pandemic outbreak, because everything that you all are saying is actually correct. There are things between men and women and all this kind of, but what we need to do now going forward as the leaders to teach the youngsters or our future generation, let us just work together and move forward. That's just my comment, because gender is about everybody. And there was a question that Peter raised. I don't know if you saw it in the chat, and it would have been good if someone could have actually responded back to that question.
Thank you, Alwyn. I don't know if I may.
Sure, Rhoda, I want to give time for both you and Tonni to respond to this. And there were a few other questions up in the chat, but then if you also want to provide just some closing remarks in your response, and we'll wrap up following this question.
Okay, well, maybe Tonni can respond first then. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Rhoda. I think is it a question that you're referring to, Alwyn, that was different than the one we answered before around the marginalization of males? If it
Yes.
is, I don't think I saw it.
Can
Rhoda,
I
you're
read it
muted.
for you? Can I read it for
Yes.
you?
Yes, please.
It says, I'm not seeing okay.
I think it might be there. If it's the marginalization of males, that is the that was our responding back to, in the sense of we just need to work together, because male, female, whatever the case may be, male, double male, and this whole all life matters. So it's all life matters. So we just need to work together. In the Caribbean, we're actually unique, and this is where we as a Caribbean community need to just now come together and do what we need to do, work together. And the other question that I did ask, it wasn't what is actually the priority of the governments.
But I wanted to say, the question I had asked. The question I had asked.
Just jump in because I do have to leave. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The question I had asked in the chat was, have we not been paying enough attention to the nexus between gender and socioeconomic situations?
Okay, I don't think we have. That's my answer. I don't think we have. I think that now governments are starting to pay more attention to it. In some ways, because the development world is starting to pay more attention to it. Canada has a feminist policy, and other organizations are saying if you have any kind of program that you want support from, including the Green Climate Fund and other funds, you need to mainstream gender. It can't just be a checklist. That's one thing. With regards to the All Lives Matter, absolutely, all lives matter. However, because of historical oppressions, which we cannot live in forever, but we must be cognizant of and recognize that they have contributed to our present. There are some groups that are further behind than others, whether it is because of your race, your ability or disability, your sex or your gender. All lives matter. However, you sometimes need to focus on certain groups. And I believe Emmett spoke to this yesterday as well, like empowerment of women to get to the point where all lives do actually matter. And this is some of the challenges we fall into when we speak about gender mainstreaming, is you can lose the focus on where the marginalized groups actually are if you don't use data and a good lens to see where people are and why they are.
Yes, I just wanted to, thanks, Tonni. I just wanted to say that gender and socioeconomic situations, I think many years ago when we began a lot of this new work, that was a critical issue. In fact, in the Caribbean, we were often criticized for focusing too much on that and not enough on the other important issues like gender socialization, interpersonal relationships between women and men, and those nitty-gritty things that are important, but which we don't often look at. Now, I think what happened in the last 2 decades is the whole question of socioeconomic situations. The big focus became entrepreneurship. In other words, other than tourism, where women and men to some extent, but women in particular, were losing jobs in so many of these areas, the big result was entrepreneurship, which is why you had so many people. I know some of the islands, when you walk down the main street, the entire street is filled with vendors, sometimes importing cheap stuff, selling, sometimes making, sometimes with, and then everybody's competing with the other person to eke out a living. So the production in the society, the people who used to sew, the people who used to knit, the people who used to make things, woodworkers, boat builders, all of these things had kind of just were melting away. So I think that this is an opportunity. I'm so glad to hear Tonni say this, to really rethink and to once more look at things in a new way and in a sustainable way, and not just put the responsibility back on the very people who we say that we are trying to help. So if I were to give some closing remarks, I'd just like to say how inspiring it is to see so many of you on this chat, so many of you who are interested and who are willing to take the time to be part of this with us. So I hope that you continue to enjoy the entire series. I think that the area of gender and mainstreaming in fisheries is extremely important, especially for island states that we are. I have been particularly concerned about the huge trawlers that scrape the bottom of the sea where I live, taking away even the baby fish. And I have seen how the cost of local fish has skyrocketed, whereas we are now importing packets of tilapia from China at very cheap prices. So that I think that looking at the whole global value chain and trade policies and how our fisheries is located in that and what we need to do to address that is very important. And also in looking at the traditional sexual division of labor of women in fisheries. I remember going to Africa and seeing these women on the huge rivers in their little boats going around. And I was saying, you know, I hardly see that in the Caribbean. So I think that there are lots of new opportunities that we have not yet explored in the area of fisheries. And I look forward to all of you bringing our fisheries to new heights because of its importance also to us as a good source of protein. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. And Tonni, I want to give you just a quick minute to provide some closing remarks and recognizing that we need to wrap up then following that, if you are still online with us.
Margot, this is Molly. Tonni has had to sign off.
Oh, okay. Well, great then. I think the professor's remarks were a perfect culminating piece for where we are with this project. She, mentioned being inspired, and I have to say I'm inspired by this discussion today and cannot thank our panelists enough. So I ask everyone to join me in thanking them. And also, of course, being inspired by all the participation that we have on here, that we know that you all are interested and engaged, and you're taking the initiative to learn more about these complex dynamics on gender and the linkages with gender and fisheries, and how we can work to address and transform change. So with that, I think just another warm thanks, and we will be in touch with resources from this. Professor Reddock, if you want to share your resources from the study, that's great, and we can share it out with all the participants from today and the broader capacity building session group. And we will see, hopefully, all of you next Tuesday again for the next session. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, and goodbye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.